to of the 2022 CNAS National Security Conference. This one is on the Russia-China nexus. How should the United States compete? And our expert panel will examine how the deepening relationship between Russia and China, particularly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, will shape American national security and foreign policy strategy, and what the closer ties between Russia and China mean for the United States, or Russia and China themselves, and for Europe and other allies and partners around the world. Before I hand it over to Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian to kick off the panel, I want to take a moment to again recognize our conference sponsors, which include American Rheinmetall Defense, the Boeing Company, Elbit Systems, Exeger, Leidos, Palace Advisors, and the Common Mission Project. Thanks to you and to our institutional donors for helping to bring together this great group of experts as part of our 2022 conference series. And of course, thank you also to our media partner Axios, which has been wonderful to work with throughout. And now let me turn it over to Bethany, and she will kick off our closing panel. Bethany.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm so pleased to join CNAS today for its annual National Security Conference. Allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have, of course, Richard, who will be joining us for the panel. We have Andrea Kendall-Taylor, CNAS Senior Fellow and Director of the Transatlantic Security Program at CNAS. Andrea's research focuses on Russia, authoritarianism, and the Russia-China relationship. We also have with us today Jim Steinberg, who is Dean of the School of Advanced International Affairs at Johns Hopkins University, School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He was formerly the Deputy National Security Advisor under Clinton and Deputy Secretary of State under Obama. We also have with us today Jennifer Lind, Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth. Jennifer is also working on a book about China's ability to rise to great power, which explores how an authoritarian state could innovate and become a technology leader. I will start off by asking each panelist one question. I'll ask a panelist a question, they'll answer for a few minutes, and I'll go down the line. And then after that, I will open it up. I will lead with questions. We'll have a conversation with each other. And I do want to remind our listeners that we welcome your questions. So throughout our discussion, starting right now, you can submit your questions in the chat. You can also submit them on Twitter using the hashtag CNAS2022. So I will start with Andrea. A question for you. What factors have brought Russia and China together? Is it accurate to call this an authoritarian axis?
Great. Well, thanks, Bethany. It's great to be here. And I would say, yes, I think it is accurate to call this an authoritarian axis. And in terms of what has brought them together, I think we have to remember that Russia's first invasion of Ukraine back in 2014 was itself a critical catalyst in this deepening relationship. And of course, their warming ties go back much further than that, really to the waning days of the Cold War. But it really was 2014 and the fact that Russia at that point really no longer saw any opportunities in the West that accelerated the deepening of their partnership. And since that time, both countries have really leaned into this relationship. And there's a number of factors that I think bring them together. They both, first and foremost, share a view of the United States as their primary threat. That's number one. They both share an intent to undermine U.S. power and influence. I think they both share a view of, or share a fear of democracy. And they believe that the U.S. weaponizes that to spread America's own influence and to undermine, their own regimes in their respective countries. We shouldn't forget Putin and Xi have also a close personal relationship. And we can talk about, they just had a phone call yesterday for Xi's birthday, the phone call. But those two leaders have spent more time together than most pairs of world leaders everywhere. And that is an important driver of this relationship. They share this authoritarian regime type. And when you look at some of the political science literature, oftentimes regime type can facilitate cooperation between countries. It's certainly true in democracies. And I think it is also true in many authoritarian regimes. And then there's tons of just purely practical reasons that they have a close relationship. They have complementary capabilities and interests. And so just to give an example, historically, we've seen Russia sell increasingly sophisticated weapon systems to the Chinese, and the Chinese in turn give a lot of cash and investment in Russian projects that Russia needs to finance their economy. So there is this, across all these different domains, technology, the economy, there's a practicality and a complementarity that just naturally feeds the relationship. It's just, I think, just to note, there are, of course, differences between them. They're not aligned on every issue, and they have diverging interests in some regions. So I don't want to overstate the depth of their partnership. But I think the one point that I would really want to drive home for the purpose of this discussion today is that I expect their partnership will only continue and, if not, grow in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yes, it is the case that Beijing has been very cautious during the first months of this war. China doesn't want to elicit any unnecessary blowback by jumping in with 2 feet behind Russia. But I expect that as soon as that international spotlight starts to dim or move away from Ukraine, that we would see Xi lean in efforts to support his closest strategic partner in the Kremlin. And that's what Putin is for him. It's what we saw in 2014. There was a kind of tepid response then. And as soon as the world moved on, Putin and Xi were all in together. And that's what I expect this time around too.
Thank you so much for that really great response. I just want to ask one follow-up. I think the Russia-China relationship kind of, the idea that it existed and mattered and was important kind of exploded in DC, in sort of the policy circles here, or in maybe, media discussions just, months before the invasion of Ukraine this year. But in reality, that relationship has been building steadily over time. Can you give us maybe just a few main dates or events that contributed to Moscow and Beijing coming together?
I think for me, again, the key catalyst is really 2014, as I just mentioned. The relationship, again, it started in the waning days of the Cold War. And I think both countries at that time calculated, they obviously share a huge, long border, and they have had disputes along that shared border. And I think both countries have decided that they would rather see peace and stability there so that they can turn their efforts and focus on what they both believe is their number one security challenge, and that is the United States. So there's been a whole host of efforts to tamp down the tensions that have existed historically in their relationship and to build that enduring partnership. I think it's notable. So there have been key milestones. 2014 for me is the most important. But I think it's also it's worth remembering kind of what partnerships are made of. It's really very much about repeated interaction. And of course, there's historical distrust between them. People talk about the fact that, they don't think very highly of one another. Historically, that's been a problem. But the more repeated interaction that two countries have, it can help overcome historical mistrust. I mentioned it started at the top with Putin and Xi, that it has been driven top down, but there are more and more technology exchanges, education exchanges, joint ventures, more infrastructure, bridges being built that bridge the two territories. I think a new bridge was just completed very recently in Russia's Far East, linking to China. So having these repeated interactions, I think, is the substance of a relationship. And I think that's what's happening. Is the longer this goes on, I think it is creating a very stable foundation for a mature and enduring relationship.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Next, I will ask Jennifer Lind, with Taiwan in mind, what has China learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Thanks so much, Bethany. It's really wonderful to be on this amazing panel. So there's so many different things that we've been observing and that no doubt China's been observing since this war began. We could talk about the response of the United States and NATO and, we might say the West, the dramatic effect of indirect military support and massive aid and the effect that that's had on the war. We could talk about Russia's assumptions, faulty assumptions about how hard the Ukrainians would fight and whether or not the government would stand or flee. We could talk about the powerful sanctions regime that got going after the invasion and how Russia's been cut off from the global economy as a result of that, and what the Chinese are likely concluding from that about their own situation in the event of a war. And then there are all the lessons from the military campaign, and those are also really sobering for China. So there's a big lesson about the need to take into account not only military hardware, but what scholars of military effectiveness call the software of warfighting. So noting that Russia's military didn't have the kind of innovative learning culture that leads to high quality performance in military operations, that civil military relations, notably communications about military capabilities were not as open as perhaps they needed to be, that the Russian army lacked warfighting experience, and notably it was not experienced in the key arts of logistics and in combined arms operations. So when the Chinese look at all of this, any sensible observer should feel pretty sick to their stomach, because basically China ticks all of these boxes. Like Russia, it's recently engaged in military reforms. And we have no idea how effective those reforms have been, how committed these institutions are to them, how successfully they're carrying them out, and to what extent they have been transforming an antiquated, bloated organization that was very much focused on ground forces and not remotely focused on joint warfighting. The Chinese are probably realizing also that, how should I put this? If they want to fight the war over Taiwan, that shouldn't be their first war. And so probably drawing from this, the realization that if they want to, play in the Super Bowl, they're going to have to play a few games beforehand. And that's a pretty sobering thing when we think about the number of China's territorial disputes and the various ways in which it might be tempted to use force in East Asia. And so again, looking forward, as we're looking at this and thinking about the lessons that China's learned, we should be looking at what are they doing to rectify their own perceptions, their perception of their own vulnerability. And frankly, we should probably be expecting China to engage in military force toward the goal of getting better at war fighting for the war that it really cares about for someday.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I have several follow-up questions, but I think I'll hold them to put to the whole group, especially about whether or not the Russian invasion of Ukraine has maybe served as a form of deterrence for China invading Taiwan. But we'll get to that later. I would now like to ask a question of Richard. Europe seems to be souring on China. Is China's refusal to oppose Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its apparent rhetorical support in some ways, is that a strategic mistake? Or is Xi Jinping working towards a larger long-term goal?
I do think that sentiment in Europe is turning against China, and in large part, but not exclusively, because at the time of Europe's peril, Beijing has sided with the aggressor. The political effect that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has had in Europe, I think, is hard to overstate. Maybe something equivalent to 9/11 in terms of our reorientation of the way we perceive threats and what's necessary to defend ourselves and the kind of relationships we need to have. And then, into this came Beijing saying, well, really, it was the Americans that cornered Russia and sort of pushed them into this. And by the way, there's biological weapons labs the Americans are running in Ukraine, and NATO expansion should have stopped a long time ago anyway, and taking the Russian position. Now, as the Russians have faltered, the Chinese seem to want two things simultaneously. One, to support the Russian position in opposition to a Western-dominated international order and all of the things that kind of go with that. On the other hand, not to be tainted by the antipathy that this aggression is creating in Europe and in other places, but it cannot have both of those at the same time. I think we saw this. One data point was at the China-EU summit when the Chinese came in absolutely adamant that they would talk about anything except Russia-Ukraine, and the Europeans came in only wanting to talk about Russia-Ukraine, and in fact did so. And Joseph Borrell, the EU foreign policy chief, said it was dialogue of the deaf. And then, of course, this follows on some changing sentiment in Europe. When Lithuania allowed the Taiwanese to use Taiwan instead of Taipei in their representative office, China reacted with a complete economic ban on the country and things like that. So I think the Chinese see Europe and the United States as two distinct power centers that are at least theoretically severable. But I think the Chinese have made their lives significantly more difficult in making inroads in Europe. That's not to say there won't still be commercial deals and trade, just like there frankly is with the United States. But I think as a diplomatic and geopolitical matter, it's going to be tougher for them.
Do you think that China really understood when it, just very shortly before Russia's invasion, that was when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, made their announcement about a no holds barred, a no limits partnership. Do you think that Xi feels a little bit of regret about that it put him in an uncomfortable position? Or do you think that that maybe in the short term it's uncomfortable, but in the long term it plays into his goals?
Well, at least at this point, Russia has got to look like a less valuable quasi-ally than it did in January. I mean, its military looks much less capable than everyone, probably including the Chinese, thought. Its economy will be smaller than it was in January, and that's going to continue indefinitely. It is more diplomatically isolated and is distrusted by virtually everybody in the world. I mean, maybe Belarus or somebody. And so that makes them a less valuable ally. I don't think that's nearly enough to sever or even set back the drive that the Chinese leadership has for a closer relationship with Russia because of these bigger kind of overarching goals that Andrea was describing. But certainly there may be a little bit of buyer's remorse about, this full-throated, no limits partnership, which you declare a few days before Russia launches a disastrous invasion of its neighbor.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, Richard. And we'll go now to Jim. And some people have suggested that the U.S. should try to pull an opposite Henry Kissinger. Actually, I think Henry Kissinger himself has even suggested this, getting closer to Russia in order to peel Moscow away from Beijing, opposite of what we did in the late 60s and early 70s. Others recommend a united Western front against both. How should the U.S. respond to this authoritarian axis?
I got it. Sorry. Great to be here with everybody at CNAS in this great conference, and especially to be on a panel chaired by such a distinguished SAIS alum. I think we have to step back in a couple of respects, because part of the problem here is, I think people, the characterization of what happened with the re-engagement with China in 1973 was, I think, somewhat different than the sort of the shorthand version that people are talking about now. If you'll remember back then, for those of us who were around at the time, the goal wasn't to side with China against Russia. The goal was to be closer to each of them than they were to each other. And at the same time that Kissinger and Nixon were going to Beijing, they were also deepening ties and building détente with the Soviet Union, trading off each other who was going to get the first summit and the like. And so this wasn't sort of playing China against Russia. This was basically trying to see whether you could actually be close to both of them. Which would be a real challenge here. It's hard enough for us to be close to either of them, given the nature of these regimes and their policies. And so I think if you think back to what Secretary Kissinger and President Nixon saw as their strategy, it really doesn't much correspond with the current situation. But I also think if you think about U.S. policy, it's important to really understand the dynamic in the Russia-China relationship. I agree with almost everything that Andrea said, but the important point to supplement what she said was this is an extraordinarily asymmetric relationship. Russia needs China badly for all kinds of reasons, economic, political, almost everything. China welcomes the partnership. There's a lot to be had with Russia. It doesn't need Russia. And so this causes an enormous problem in terms of taking the relationship forward, because China can basically dictate the terms pretty much. It is true that it gets technology and military equipment from Russia, but the need is declining over time as China becomes much more technologically sophisticated. 20 years ago, they didn't know how to build a fighter. Now they do. They didn't know how to build an aircraft carrier. Now they do. They depended on Russia for air defense. They're moving forward in that. They're ahead of Russia possibly in hypersonics. And so the value to China, I mean, it's great because they can get cheap oil because Russia needs to have an outlet for its oil and gas. But it is one in which they don't need it. So they're going to obviously take advantage of the benefits that China can get from the relationship with Russia, but also have the ability to distance when they need to, as they are doing to some extent now. And the second thing is, this has illustrated not only is Russia an awkward partner in terms of how it's conducted the war in Ukraine, but it's an awkward partner because Russia is not an economic success. And China has a very clear vision about how to succeed economically in the 21st century, none of which Putin and Russia is doing in terms of, technological advance and trying to drive that. I mean, Russia is a petrostate, and absent oil and gas would be a very, very minor plan, and of course, nuclear weapons. So this relationship is one in which it's very convenient for China to have Russia. It's a classic balance of power thing. As Andrea said, the U.S. is the threat to both of them. They don't want a hegemonic United States, and so they see each other as allies. But for China, a lot of other partners are very important too, and we've seen that in the context of what's happening here, because what China has really built on and focused on is not the Russia-China relationship since the war in Ukraine, but the China-Saudi Arabia and Gulf state relationship and the relationship in ASEAN and others, and try to make sure that they don't lose those ties by being seen as too close to Russia. So that has big implications for our policy, right? Which is that there isn't much we can do to get closer to Russia, even if we wanted to and even if we saw an advantage, because we will never be able to offer Russia what China can offer Russia. And so then the question becomes, is there some way for us to get closer to China? And of course, that goes to the $64 trillion question about the long-term relationship between the United States and China. So I think that this kind of idea that somehow that there's a ploy that can be played to either drive a wedge between them or to balance one off the other really doesn't understand the dynamic of the policy. And what we really need to think about here is, if we are going to have a policy which is basically seeing both as our primary competitors, we have to accept the fact that if we're going to do that, inevitably it will drive the two of them closer together.
Thank you so much for that, Jim. I want to remind our listeners that they can submit questions in the chat, and remember to go on Twitter if you wish and use the hashtag CNAS 2022, and I will incorporate those questions into the rest of our discussion. I'd like to go back now to the follow-up that I would like to pose first to Jennifer, and then to anyone else on the panel who would like to engage with it. Going back to Taiwan, I think there's several issues here that the discussion of the relationship between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan has, again, really animated discussion in DC. There was speculation that maybe Putin was invading Ukraine partially so that China could invade Taiwan while the West was distracted. There's been discussion about does the very unified Western response to Ukraine that seems to have surprised China, would that actually prevent China from invading Taiwan in the near-term future, or maybe even in the long-term future? There's several questions there. Choose what you want to engage with, and Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, I think that we're right to ask these questions about what are the Chinese thinking in the wake of Russia's invasion? What lessons are they learning for Taiwan, and so on? And there's all sorts of really interesting things to debate. Sometimes the coverage has this quality of, the Chinese have been sort of crouched and willing to and ready to pounce on Taiwan, and now there's like a green light, or now they've had the realization they can do this or something. And it sort of obscures the fact that this is a country with, its own interests, its own calculations, its own goals. It's very nuanced and specific strategic calculations that, again, just because Russia does something in Europe doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be some dramatic effect on Chinese calculations. So I think we can, as I said, I think it's absolutely right. There are lessons to be learned here and to debate, but I think we can overstate the extent to which China's calculus toward Taiwan has anything to do with what's going on in Europe. And so again, the first lesson is to say China's had a long-term goal toward Taiwan, and we don't know exactly what the use of force is going to be, if it's going to happen. And importantly, we also don't know if there would be an actual Chinese invasion of Taiwan. In my remarks and many people in their remarks, they immediately leap to this idea of, what would a Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan look like, and what are the lessons from Ukraine about the difficulty of that? On the other hand, what do we know about China? We know that it is really clever about salami tactics, about changing the facts on the ground, about interventions that are non-kinetic, right? And so absolutely, we should expect China to be relying very heavily on that playbook. And so that's something that, again, has unfolded already and will keep unfolding, and we should be paying a lot of attention to, maybe even more attention relative to, an actual Chinese amphibious invasion or other kind of kinetic way to coerce or conquer Taiwan.
If I could just add, because I completely agree with Jennifer. I think that China has its own calculus about what it needs to do to keep Taiwan sufficiently within its orbit and to prevent it from slipping away. And that's going to be the only factor that drives what China does, whether it uses a blockade or coercion or even potentially military force. So you might want to ask the flip question, which is what are the lessons that Taiwan is learning from this? Because I do think this is important, and that then may play back into China's calculation, because I do think this has had a profound impact on Taiwan in terms of both, in some respects, giving the Taiwanese more confidence that they may be able to actually resist certain kinds of coercion by Beijing if it comes to that, but also that it needs to do some very specific things to be able to do that. And that, of course, will also lead to perhaps closer ties with the United States. That, in turn, if Taiwan starts to do that, if Taiwan actually starts to strengthen its military capacity, its ability to resist, and gets closer to the United States, both militarily and politically, that may well influence Beijing's calculation. So it's sort of a second-order consequence of the operation rather than a direct decision by Beijing, either that this shows you can get away with it or that it shows you that you'll risk sanctions if you don't.
If I could just add one quick thing to that. So I think everybody's, trying to learn something from this, but even if the Chinese are learning from this with the idea of applying this in the future, it's still hard to tell which way that cuts. So one could imagine Xi Jinping and company saying, wow, I didn't realize that the whole world, or at least large parts of the richest part of the world, the G7 and so forth, would come together in these sanctions and export controls and really try to harm the Russian economy. Putin might be, risk averse or risk tolerant enough to gamble with that, but maybe I'm not. On the other hand, you can imagine them saying, well, that's the kind of thing they would do to Russia. It's not the kind of thing they're going to do to China, because for the reason that Jim said before, that what the sanctioning countries, what the self-sanctioning companies and so forth have to lose by virtue of sanctioning Russia is so much less than they would have to lose in sanctioning China. And of course, the areas where they have the most to lose in oil and gas, they've either carved out exceptions or they've tried to stage this kind of thing. So, what conclusion the Chinese are drawing, even from the sanctions response, I think is just very hard to tell, and how much they equate themselves with the Russian position here.
Well, while we're all chiming in, I feel like I should, although I'm not a China watcher. So in the spirit, though, of learning lessons, I think, one of the lessons as a Russia watcher that I think would want to apply to the China context is also like the perils of personalism, right? So we've talked a lot about in the context of Russia, Putin has been extremely risk tolerant. He's pursued increasingly risky and aggressive policies over time. And guess what? We see the same personalization. Obviously, there are differences between the Russian and the Chinese system. So they're not the same. There's many, many important differences. But we do see Xi personalizing the political system in China. And I think we see some of the same dynamics that have made it really hard to gauge exactly what the lengths that Putin would be willing to go to in advance of Russian foreign policy interests. So the tight control in Russia over the media space, so the public only receives the official narrative events, that limited Putin's accountability to the public. And it provided him with great latitude for risk-taking. I think you have a similar thing in China. The fact that in Russia, there was an elimination of competing voices within his regime so that he was only hearing what it is that he wanted to hear, that he had this echo chamber that only gets information that supports his preferred policies and approaches. I think that's increasingly happening in China as well. And so it gets really difficult to gauge a country's foreign policy calculus when the decision is increasingly up to one person. And I know it's not a direct parallel between Russia and China. But, while Russian troops were sitting on the border of Ukraine, there were so many people out there who said, that's not in Russia's national interest. Why would Putin do that? Think of all the costs that he would elicit. And yet he did it. And so I think, again, it's just the perils of personalism. And I think it will force us to think very hard about what's driving decision-making in China moving forward. That, I think, for me, that's an important lesson.
Great, thank you for that. I've got a question here from the audience, from Alice W. How do you assess the rest of the world's reaction to Russian and Chinese assertions that it is Western sanctions and not Russia's aggression in Ukraine that is responsible for food insecurity, increased energy prices, and the global recession? And then a corollary to that, how is the information war proceeding? Feel free to jump in.
Yeah, and let others. I think that Washington has a problem. Russia is not nearly as isolated as we would like to think on the international stage. And so, yes, we can collectively pat ourselves on the back because the transatlantic response has been outstanding, as has many, Indo-Pacific allies have been on board, Japan and others. So in that kind of core group of allies, it has been a very united response in condemning Russia. But that is not the picture in the rest of the world. You think about the Indians, the Vietnamese, the South Africans. Not one African country has levied sanctions on Russia. And so I'm maybe picking on one thing that Richard said is that maybe Beijing sees Russia as a less valuable ally. I'm not sure as time goes on that will necessarily be the case. Yes, the military has been exposed for being far less capable than we ever imagined. But if they do turn the corner and they do start to generate a little bit more momentum in the Donbass, I see the narrative that the Kremlin is trying to push now, which is, look, Russia on a peacetime footing can beat Ukraine. We're acting all on our own while Ukraine has the backing of every single NATO member state. So these are the narratives that they're going to be pushing. And they aren't as isolated as I think we like to think. So it is a problem. And I think Russia, along with China, is very aggressively pushing these narratives that that Russia is not at fault. Richard mentioned the chemical weapons labs. These are real narratives that permeate governments all around the world that our U.S. officials are up against every day. So it's a real challenge. And you can see the administration taking it seriously, increasing engagements with India and South Africa and trying to counter this challenge. But I think it is a serious one.
If I could add, one of the things that I think is a problem for us and has been successful on the Russian part is being able to sort of characterize this as not really a war about Ukraine, but a proxy conflict between Russia and the United States, and that that the whole Ukraine story is not about a true Ukrainian nationalism, but rather something that was cooked up in Washington as a way of weakening and keeping Russia down. And that narrative has a lot of resonance in a lot of other places. The idea that the United States is pushing its own agenda to the detriment of others. You hear even in India the sort of talk that Ukraine is really a proxy war between Russia and the United States. And so, there's been, the administration has worked very, very hard to engage other countries and to explain it. And has successfully resisted, I think it's extremely important, the imposition of secondary sanctions on countries that continue to do business with Russia. Even though it's tempting because it does give Russia an outlet, it really would have a huge impact on others, seeing that the United States is trying to weaponize trade and finance against them rather than against Russia. The other thing that will be critical is that we have got to find a way to help countries that depend on Russia and Ukrainian grain for food, whether this is opening up Odessa or finding other ways to support it, because this is no country that's food insecure can withstand the need to engage with Russia to get access to what it can. And that's something that, we're doing a lot economically and militarily to help Ukraine. We've got to think very hard about what we can do to help others who are hurting very badly as a result of this conflict.
Jennifer, you've studied authoritarianism and innovation, and I look at the way that Russia has innovated in its disinformation, its global disinformation campaigns, and also the way that China has emulated Russia, and now they work together. And I'm curious if you have any insights about how they have been able to do that so effectively, or if maybe you think it's not effective. Jennifer, if you could unmute your microphone.
Sorry, I think the most important takeaway, and the other panelists have been touching on this, is just to what extent the global narrative matters, and to what extent the various actors are striving to influence the global narrative. And I think we in the U.S. have a very I think we're way overconfident about our own, what's been called soft power, and we seriously underestimate the soft power of China. And I mean, that's a country I've been studying. I'm not going to speculate on how the other countries are viewing Russia right now, but the other panelists have mentioned that there's a lot more sympathy around the world than we might have expected for Russia rather than Ukraine. So again, China as a country that has clawed its way up back to a position at the economic pinnacle of the world that it was stripped from by the imperialist powers in the 19th century. China is a country that understands economic development. China is a country that's standing up to a United States that's been using force all around the world in very dramatic ways and in very dangerous ways for the past several decades. There's strong sympathy for a country standing up to the U.S. in this way, and for a country with China's economic bona fides. And so the idea of China as a leader in this, G77 or just in the global South and so on, I think that's something that we really should remember. And again, when we academics in New England talk about America's amazing levels of soft power because of the use of the English language and all these other, Hollywood and all these things we have going for us. Yeah, we have a lot of soft power in lots of places around the world. But there's a lot of places that view the U.S. with distrust, with skepticism, and they are very interested in China's growth model, and they're interested in what China has to say. And if they're an authoritarian country, they're deeply interested in the way that China runs its country and what it might do for them. So I think all of that just reminds us that though we tend to be prone to underestimating the support for Chinese narratives around the world and possibly for Russia's, that's something that we should do at our peril.
Richard has mentioned economic, and others have mentioned the sanctions on Russia. I know that Russia had made it sort of a big fanfare about sanction-proofing its economy. I'm curious how effective their attempts to sanction-proof their economy have been, and what China is, how does China fit in with that? Is China providing an economic lifeline? Is Beijing looking to reshape the economy to sanction-proof itself? Several questions in there. And Richard, why don't we start with you?
Well, the Russians reportedly thought that by pulling together a very large stock of foreign reserves, then they would be able to sanction-proof their economy, perhaps not realizing that half those foreign reserves would actually be frozen and unavailable for their use, which of course is what happened there. They have put a lot of work through the central bank in defending the ruble and the value of the ruble, so that the value of the ruble is at or above where it was at the beginning. But in the course of doing that, it's had to raise interest rates and restrict capital flows. It's going to have a significant negative impact on their growth rate. The percentage decline in GDP growth this year is probably going to be somewhere between 10 and 15%. The mayor of Moscow said not that long ago he expects 200,000 more unemployed in the next few months. But of course, the price of oil is at a huge high. And because of the inelasticity, I'm a SAIS grad myself, so I need to start to wonk out on the econ stuff. But because of the inelasticity of the demand, the price shoots up, and therefore the revenue that go into the Russian coffers shoot up accordingly, even if their total supply of exported oil goes down, which it has. How does that all net out? Well, they're still clearly on their feet now. I think the biggest thing over the long run is going to be these export controls that are going to deny key technology inputs, because so many of the Russian products, and I'm not just talking about iPhones and things like that, but weapons and just other products that they have Western technological components, whether it's chips or anything else. And some of that can be replaced by Chinese substitutes, but not all of them can be replaced by Chinese substitutes. And you're going to see real interruptions in supplies and in production in Russia over the long run, which is going to have a long-term constraining impact on the economy's ability to grow.
Okay. Jim, you have vast experience in formulating U.S. policy under pretty complex conditions. How would you evaluate the U.S. response so far to what, to Russia and China coming closer together? And what steps do you think that need to take place in the future and that are not being taken now to do a better job?
So I think the administration gets very high marks for the response. I think that, from the beginning, even before the actual invasion, with the decision to share with the world their information about what they perceive correctly to be Putin's intentions, to their efforts in Europe and around the world to engage the United States, but not look like it was the U.S. was just imposing this, but really to get this as a coordinated effort among many allies, I think was an impressive performance. And I think that the administration has been careful about making sure that we are seen as being categorically not rewarding aggression. On the other hand, sensitive to the risk of either intentional or unintentional escalation. And I think that, efforts like the president's op-ed to kind of lay out how the U.S. was thinking about the use of force and the options there was really a very thoughtful attempt to engage and speak to the broader public. The problem that remains, however, and it's not an easy one, so I don't mean to be critical in saying this, but the problem remains is, how does the story end? Right. Right now, the administration, for reasons that are understandable, is basically saying we're not going to pressure Zelensky to do anything. But one gets the impression that they're hoping that Zelensky will cut a deal, because if he doesn't, then how does the story end? And so it is an awkward situation, because the U.S. interests are very profound here, and they are largely aligned with Ukraine, but they're not identical to Ukraine. And so the question is, how do you do this? And particularly, how do you extricate yourself from this? I mean, the Russians aren't going to just say, never mind, we were wrong, this is terrible, we admit terrible things. And so even if there's some kind of armistice, stalemate, and the like, we're in a long-term situation in which the United States has comprehensive sanctions against Russia, is refusing to, countenance Russia being in international organizations and go to meetings with the Russians. And this could go on for a long, long, long time. And that's the part that I think, is the challenge now, is to find a way to make clear that there's got to be a way forward, and the way forward can only be an absolute and unequivocal defeat of Russia, because it's possible that will happen. It's possible that Putin will die. It's possible that Putin will be overthrown. Anything's possible. But these are all things that we don't have much control over. And it's problematic when your policy depends on events over which you can't control. So that, I think, is the next big challenge for the administration, is to try to articulate how it sees the options going forward and what it sees as the long-term plausible outcome here. That's hard to do when you're in the middle of a conflict, but for all of us who've studied wars and the like, it's quite important to think about war termination. I've been spending some time looking back at World War I, and the questions, how did Wilson think about that then, and what would be an acceptable outcome for the United States from that conflict? So I think that's really good marks so far, but need more focus on how do we think about the long term.
Can I add, I'll maybe add a couple of things. I mean, I generally agree with Jim, although, I would say that just recently Fareed Zakaria had the op-ed about like the best way to defeat China is to defeat Russia or something along those lines. So I guess, I would advocate, that the United States really should be leaning in and continuing to do much more to get the weapons in the hands of Ukrainians so that we can strengthen their position at the bargaining table. Zelensky has said it, the president has said it, that this will eventually end at the bargaining table. But now is not the time to end the conflict, because it would basically concede territory to Russia that they didn't have at the February 24th. So I think we talked about, that Putin and Xi have this close personal relationship, that Xi has invested personally in this deep partnership with Putin and with Russia. To weaken that and to weaken Xi's standing, I think a solid defeat of Russia would be in the best interest of our China policy. So I would say doing more to ensure that the Ukrainians have what they need is an effective way also to get at the Chinese. And Jim made the joke about, Putin could die at any time. And that is true. But I actually think it's a proposition that the United States should think about seriously. I don't think that we will be able to drive a wedge between Russia and China. That will be a fool's errand. And so a goal should be to try to mitigate the extent to what either partner is willing to do for the other, right? I think what we would want, and the way I've thought about it before the war, is that we would want a Russia that's pursuing a more balanced foreign policy. That's in our interest. And that's what Russia has always said it wanted to do. As Jim said, right now at this moment, and I think the president's helicopters are flying over our house, that Putin doesn't have any choice other than Xi. But there could be a change in calculus once Putin dies. And again, not that any future Russian leader is going to radically shift Russian foreign policy. I do think that that's not the case. And any future Russian leader is going to want to have at least a close, pragmatic relationship with China. But what will be on offer from the West once we get to that point? I think these are the things we need to be thinking about. Do we want Russia and Moscow to have options at that point so that they can pursue a more balanced foreign policy such that they're not all in with China at that time? So to me, that's going to be an important crossroads that's worth thinking about now, because I would say that Putin's hold on power, even though he will likely ride this out, it's more tenuous now than it was before.
If I can pick up just on the first point that you made in response to Jim, and maybe channel what I think Jim was saying, which is different than what you were objecting to. And Jim, of course, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think the point is that we should force it into the war now, or that we should force Ukraine to give up territory, or that we shouldn't lean in or anything. I think actually Jim's point, which I totally agree with, if this is in fact the point, is far more brutal than that in a way, which is to say the administration's position is, how long does this war go on? How does it end? That's totally not, we have no dog in that fight. We have no view. We have no position. It's up to the Ukrainians. We won't tell them when to negotiate, if to negotiate, what to negotiate over, what to give up, what to accept. It's all up to them. We're just in support. But that can't last. We have a huge dog in this fight. And given our role in this war, we have to have a view, even if it's not a public view, we have to have a view of what is a desirable and realistic outcome to this war, and then at least start talking to the Ukrainians about how you would get there. You can argue over what specifically that is, all-out defeat of Russia or capitulation tomorrow. There's a lot between those two things, right? So you could talk about that. But as of now, we lack any sort of sense, or at least publicly or privately articulated sense of where we, the United States, would like to see this go and how this should end.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. I think you said it better than I obviously succeeded in saying it. You know, part of the reason I mentioned World War I is our good friend Philip Zelikow at UVA has just published a remarkable study of the issue of Wilson's effort, or not successful effort, and rather half-hearted effort, to bring about a brokered end to the war in 1916. And the reason I mentioned that is because one of the things that Philip argues in the book is that, you know, that if it was going to happen, one, the U.S. had to play a role, but two, that we had to have some view about how it would come out. And that part of the reason why the effort failed was because the U.S. was sort of for a negotiated settlement, but it wasn't pressuring either side in terms of what would be acceptable. And so that was kind of, because it's in the forefront of my mind, having just finished the book, it is exactly what Richard said, is that it does matter. I mean, I don't disagree with Andrea at all. We can't have Russia win or have some gains out of this thing. And not just, I mean, I'm a little more skeptical perhaps than she is that somehow this is, that it's going to affect, that somehow that will chasten China if Russia loses. I don't think they you know, it's not their problem. But I think vis-a-vis Russia, it matters a lot, and vis-a-vis others, it matters a lot. So I think, Richard, you said it well. Thank you.
For our final question, we have about 5 more minutes. I'm going to ask a broad, multifaceted question about alliances. We're seeing the strengthening of old alliances, attempts to scuttle alliances, and, you know, China working on building other partnerships, just a whole very dynamic landscape for partnerships and alliances around the world as a response, not really just to the Russian invasion, but to the whole rise of this of the Russia-China partnership. I'd love to hear from each of you a few thoughts about what you're seeing on that from where you stand. So, you know, the Biden administration alliance building and strengthening in Asia, China's attempts to, you know, failed attempt recently in the Pacific Islands to create a security agreement. The strengthening of NATO, or, you know, countries wanting to enter NATO, China and Russia really trying very, very hard to discredit NATO and in fact blame NATO for what's happening in Ukraine. So I'll just start from there and maybe start with Jennifer, and we'll just go the 4 of you. So about a minute or 2 each.
Thanks, Bethany. I guess I have a couple points I'd like to make. One is that I agree that China and Russia do have a lot in common in terms of particularly both having this resentment toward a United States-led world order in which they perceive the U.S. as seeking to spread democracy, liberalism, markets, and so on around the world, and they perceive that as a threat to their governments. So I think that there is that kind of, back to your first question, authoritarian axis in that sense. They're both authoritarian countries, and they do share a lot in the way I just described. On the other hand, I would say, I think Jim did a great job pointing out earlier, just to remind us how different these countries are, how different these authoritarian regimes are, and how different these economies are, and how deeply lopsided the alliance relationship is, or not, whatever we want to call it, the partnership is. And so the more that we paint a picture of sort of two authoritarian behemoths, you know, tightly allied against the United States, you know, and very similar in political economies, I think that's probably not a helpful view to have of these countries. And then another point is just to remember the fluidity of this triangle, right? The US, China, Russia triangle, the fluidity of it over time. And we've talked about the turnaround in US-China relations orchestrated by Kissinger and the Nixon administration. Before that, there was, of course, the Sino-Russia partnership and the just indispensable role that Russia or the Soviet Union at the time played in Chinese growth in the 1950s. So just if we look at this triangle over time, just the incredible fluidity of it. And as we sit here and we think, gosh, should we pursue an accommodation toward China? Should we try and improve relations with Russia? We think how incredibly difficult that would be under the prevailing circumstances, how that doesn't seem to make any sense. But yet again, when we go back in history and look at previous times in which these relations shifted, we saw that they often shifted despite some pretty trying conditions. So the potential is there for this as well. And just to close, also, I would just remind us that when we're talking about, is Russia really frustrating China? And is China going to learn something from this and maybe move away from Russia or something like that? I mean, allies are always frustrating and letting each other down, right? I mean, this is just a truism in statecraft. I mean, China's got North Korea, for goodness sake. It's used to having allies that are complete pain in the rear and rather asymmetric also. I mean, America's allies have been rolling their eyes at us for decades. Our allies are always letting us down. And so it's not like there's some strong, I mean, in our rhetoric, we call it this iron strong relationship or whatever of marching shoulder to shoulder. This is realpolitik. They're always letting each other down. They go through ups and downs. They have circumstances that bring them together, circumstances that draw them apart. But the reason that they're together in the first place is because they have some core underlying similar shared interest.
We're almost out of time. If for the final responses, if you can try to keep them to just about a minute or less so we can finish more or less on time.
So let me just make a 1 minute observation, which is the thing that to me that knits the two theaters together, Europe and the Pacific, Russia and China, is this debate about spheres of influence and the converse side, which is allies, right? For me, the fundamental reason this is so important is because the principle at stake here is that countries don't have a right to a sphere of influence, that countries, the Istanbul Declaration, countries should be able to choose. They have to do it in a way that's sensitive to the interests of other and neighboring states, but no country, no matter how powerful, should dictate to the others. That's why there's so much at stake as how we deal with Ukraine in terms of how the implications are for relations with China, for our alliances in both parts of the world.
I can jump in. I feel like Richard will say something very profound to end the session, so I'll let him go last. My point is, I mean, it's not on alliances, but more on this authoritarian axis idea. We shouldn't forget that Russia and China are working to support authoritarianism around the globe, and sometimes it's coordinated and sometimes it's not. But think about before this war, all of the things that Russia, often in coordination or support of China, did. Putin is backing up Lukashenko in Kazakhstan, Venezuela, Syria, the fellow strongman. They're working to popularize authoritarian governance. They're exporting their best practices. They're learning from each other. They're watering down human rights norms. They're working together in multilateral forums. They work together to build norms around cyber and internet sovereignty. They're doing all of these things. And so it is incredibly important that the democratic allies work to do the same. The war in Ukraine has been a tremendous boost to transatlantic and by extension Indo-Pacific relations, right? We were very concerned about the trajectory in the wake of Afghanistan, for example, about where we were headed. This has been a huge boon to NATO and to the transatlantic community, and it's imperative that we continue this momentum moving forward because the weakness of these authoritarian regimes is that they make mistakes. Putin's war in Ukraine was a colossal, violent mistake. Think about what she is doing with the COVID lockdown. So it's really incumbent on the democratic allies to be united and be working together so that we can take advantage of these mistakes and continue to shape the world that fits our interests.
I'll say a quick word, I guess, about our own alliances. I mean, alliances, mutual defense agreements are just insurance policies at the end of the day against threats that may or may not ever materialize. And the more acute those threats seem, the greater the value of the insurance policy and the more countries that want to join it. So, of course, we see Sweden and Finland wanting to be part of NATO when they previously didn't. We see countries in NATO wanting to spend more on defense, wanting to work together more closely. The countries and our allies in Asia signing on to the sanctions, not only to punish Russia, but also as a demonstration project about what aggression can be met with in a consolidated response. That's obviously not a reason for allies to go out and find themselves threats if they don't exist. But if you're sort of stuck with these as we are today, that does create some pretty big opportunities for us to work together in shaping exactly what Andrea said, which is the world to come, and taking as a fact not to be of Russia and China working together, not as a couple of chess pieces on the board and who are we going to send to Beijing to talk about the French Revolution and, and all this other stuff, and then kind of, drive wedges and pull one away and flip one and the other, which one is it going to be, but rather to recognize the challenge that we all have, but that the allied and like-minded countries of the world are stronger still. And so I think that is a big takeaway that we can draw from the lesson we're seeing at the moment.
Thank you so much, Richard. That is a great note to end on. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists for their time today and everyone who tuned in to this final session. And I will hand it right back over to Richard, who will close us out for today.
Okay. Well, that was the final panel. That's it. So I hope all of you who have tuned in for any or all of the previous 3 days of events took something away from it, whether that's insights, deeper knowledge, maybe a new perspective on the kinds of national security and foreign policy issues that our country faces today. If by any chance, I find this very hard to believe, but if you missed any of our proceedings, then they will all be available to rewatch. You can go to conference.cnas.org or our YouTube channel. And thank you for joining us. Thanks to all of the speakers who took time out of their very busy schedules to join us, to our media partner, and especially to our communications and events staff who put all of this together, most of whom were behind the scenes, but without whom this could not have been possible. The annual conference is the biggest event of the year for CNAS, but it's far from our only one. We'll be back soon with gatherings on all of the national security issues that CNAS examines, and we welcome each of you to join us as we do so. In the meantime, and for today, thank you and for joining us, and we will see you soon.